Officer Matty Hart, injured and half-frozen, stumbled out of the winter forest carrying 2 crying infants, believing the night would claim all 3 of them. She reached a lone cabin just as the blizzard closed in, where Ethan Cole, a reclusive veteran, and his German shepherd Bear were expecting nothing but silence. When Bear growled at the tree line and Ethan saw the fear in Matty's eyes, didn't match her badge or her story. He knew this wasn't just a rescue. As the wind howled and footsteps echoed in the snow behind them, one truth became clear. Someone was hunting a police officer and 2 innocent children. And the storm was only the beginning. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. Please stay with me and listen with all your heart. May God's gentle light rest upon you, His hands guiding this story to meet your soul. Because if you are here, this moment was never by chance. Snow pressed against the forest like a living thing, wind threading its fingers through pine needles, turning the night into a low, endless howl. Ethan Cole had learned long ago how to read that sound. At 39, he stood tall and solid in the doorway of his remote cabin, broad-shouldered beneath a weathered brown coat, the lines of his face carved sharp by years of cold and harder memories. His beard was kept short and neat, more habit than vanity, dark with threads of gray that hadn't been there when he came home from the war. His eyes, steel blue, watchful, carried the quiet distance of a man who had seen too much and learned not to explain himself anymore. Ethan was a former Army infantryman, the kind who never talked about deployments, never corrected people who guessed wrong, and never went into town unless supplies demanded it. The war had not made him cruel, but it had stripped him of softness he never bothered to reclaim. Noise unsettled him. Crowds exhausted him. Solitude, by contrast, felt honest. The cabin deep in the winter forest was not an escape. It was an agreement between him and the world. Leave me alone, and I will do the same. Beside him stood Bear. Bear was a 7-year-old German shepherd, large even for his breed, with a thick sable coat dark as wet bark and intelligent amber eyes that missed very little. His muzzle was dusted with gray, not from age, but from a scar earned years ago when he'd dragged Ethan from an icy ravine after a fall that should have ended much worse. Bear was not trained by any official program, yet he moved with the discipline of a soldier, alert, controlled, loyal to the point of stubbornness. He rarely barked without reason, and when his ears stiffened the way they did now, Ethan trusted the warning more than his own instincts. The fire inside the cabin was dying, orange embers collapsing inward with soft pops. Ethan had just finished mending a section of fence earlier that afternoon, his hands still rough and red from frozen wire. He had expected the night to end the way most did, with silence, a cup of bitter coffee, and Bear curled near the hearth. That was the routine. That was the safety. Then came the knock. Not a polite tap, not the hesitant rap of someone unsure. This was heavy, uneven, desperate. Wood struck by flesh that could no longer feel the cold properly. Bear's head snapped toward the door, muscles tightening. A low sound rose in his chest, not a growl meant to threaten, but one that asked a question. Who is out there, and why are they still alive? Ethan's hand moved without thought to the shotgun resting by the doorframe. He didn't lift it, didn't chamber around. He simply rested his palm against the stock, grounding himself. No one came this deep into the forest in winter by accident. The nearest road was miles away, buried under snowdrifts. Anyone knocking now was either lost, lying, or running. The knock came again, one strike, then another, followed by a sound Ethan hadn't expected. A woman's breath, ragged and shallow, pressed through the door. "Please, I can't. I have babies." Ethan closed his eyes for half a second, just long enough to curse the universe, God, and his own conscience in one breath. He slid the bolt free and opened the door. The wind forced its way inside first, carrying needles of snow and the sharp scent of pine. Then she stepped forward, swaying slightly, as if gravity had finally remembered her. Officer Madison "Mattie" Hart stood on his porch, her frame slight but rigid with effort. She was around 32, average height, her build athletic beneath a torn Navy police jacket that hung heavier than it should have. Her hair, light brown with natural blonde highlights, was pulled into a loose ponytail, strands plastered to her pale face by sweat and melting snow. A bruise bloomed dark along her cheekbone, and a thin line of dried blood traced her jaw. Her eyes were green, sharp even through exhaustion, the kind that assessed rooms instinctively, trained never to look away first. In her arms, wrapped together in a single, insufficient blanket, were 2 infants. They couldn't have been more than 2 months old, tiny, red-cheeked, their breaths shallow and uneven. One whimpered softly, the sound barely audible over the storm. The other slept with a fist curled against his chin, unaware of how close the night had come to swallowing them whole. Mattie held them with a grip born of instinct and fear, arms locked as if her bones themselves refused to let go. She did not cry. She did not beg. Her voice, when she spoke again, was steady only because it had been trained to be. "I'm a police officer," she said, the badge on her chest half hidden by snow and blood. "My car's gone. Radio's dead. They're following me. I just need warmth. 5 minutes." Bear stepped forward, placing himself half a pace in front of Ethan, eyes fixed on Mattie, not aggressive, not friendly. Curious. Assessing. Then his gaze dropped to the babies, and something in him shifted. His tail lowered, his ears softened. He whined once, quietly, a sound he had not made since he was a pup. Ethan felt the weight settle in his chest then, that familiar pressure of choice, the kind that had followed him home from war and never truly left. He could tell her no. He could point her toward the shed, toss her blankets, lock the door, and live with the knowledge that whatever happened next would happen beyond his walls. But the babies coughed, tiny, wet sounds that cut through the wind like glass. Ethan exhaled slowly. "Inside," he said, stepping back. "Now." Mattie hesitated, not out of fear, but habit. Officers were taught not to trust easily, especially when wounded. But Bear stepped aside, clearing the threshold, and Ethan saw the moment she decided to gamble on kindness. She crossed into the cabin, the door slamming shut behind her as the storm roared its disapproval. Warmth hit her immediately, and her knees nearly buckled. Ethan caught her elbow without thinking, his grip firm, steady, impersonal. He guided her toward the fire, laid an old quilt on the floor, and motioned for her to sit. Bear laid down beside them, his massive body forming a barrier between the door and the fragile life now occupying the room. Mattie lowered herself carefully, adjusting the blanket around the babies, checking their faces again and again like she couldn't quite believe they were still breathing. Her hands trembled now that the danger had paused. Ethan knelt, adding wood to the fire. "What happened?" he asked, voice low, controlled. She swallowed. "I found them," she said, "abandoned. Someone wanted them gone. When I called it in, they cut me off. I ran." Ethan didn't press. He'd learned the damage of asking questions too early. Outside, the wind howled louder, slamming snow against the walls as if angry at being shut out. Inside, 2 infants slept beside a dying fire. A wounded officer fought to stay upright, and a veteran realized, with a clarity that scared him, that the night had already changed everything. He looked at Bear, who met his gaze steadily. "Looks like we're not alone anymore," Ethan muttered. Bear huffed softly, as if to say they never really were. "My dear friend, are you still walking with us through this story? Thank you for your patience, for staying, and for listening with your heart." The cabin breathed differently once the door was shut, as if the walls themselves were listening. Heat gathered in uneven pockets near the stove, and the smell of pine sap and old smoke pressed close, familiar to Ethan Cole in a way few things were anymore. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned to keep panic on a short leash, adding a split log to the fire, nudging the kettle closer to warmth, tugging a chair aside so the floor near the hearth stayed clear. Bear settled into a low, protective sprawl, his heavy chest rising slow and steady, amber eyes flicking between the door and the woman on the floor. Madison Hart. Maddie, she had said, sat with her back against the cabinet, boots still on, knees drawn up just enough to cradle the weight of the two infants. Her breath shook now that the sprint had ended. Shock did that, Ethan knew. It waited politely until the danger paused, then took its seat. Maddie's injuries looked worse in the firelight. The bruise along her cheekbone had deepened to a stormy purple, and the scrape at her temple glistened where snowmelt had reopened it. She had the look of someone who had been trained to inventory damage. Quickly. Hands, ribs, head, then shove the tally aside and keep moving. Her build was compact, strength gathered in shoulders and forearms, the kind earned from long shifts and defensive training rather than vanity. The badge on her chest bore scratches, dulled from use. It was not an ornament to her. She shifted the blanket and checked the babies again, fingertips gentle, eyes sharp. One of the infants stirred, a tiny sound catching at the back of the throat. Maddie leaned down, murmuring nonsense words with a practiced cadence. The sound a rope thrown across panic. It worked. The baby settled. Ethan crouched and slid a folded wool blanket toward her. "Under them," he said, then over. His voice was calm, low. He did not kneel close enough to crowd her, a habit he'd learned overseas when proximity could escalate fear. She nodded, following instructions without offense. When the blanket was set, the baby's breaths grew quieter, more even. Their faces were flushed from cold, lashes clumped with melted snow. Two boys, Ethan thought, noticing the faint difference in brow and mouth. Twins, likely. They were astonishingly small to have crossed that much winter. Bear leaned forward and sniffed once, careful and restrained. Maddie stiffened, then relaxed as the dog withdrew and lay down again. "He's gentle," she said, surprised. Ethan allowed himself a corner of a smile. "He chooses," he replied, "same as people." She swallowed and finally looked up at him, properly this time. The green of her eyes was ringed with red, the kind that came from cold and long nights rather than tears. "Thank you," she said. The words clipped as if she didn't trust them not to shake. "I won't stay long, Her jaw tightened. "They're looking." Ethan's gaze moved to the shuttered window. Snow rattled against it like thrown sand. "Who?" he asked. She hesitated, not because she was lying, but because telling the truth would make it heavier. "Men who buy silence," she said, "and sell it." Her mouth twisted, humorless. "I interrupted a transfer. Not drugs, not weapons." She glanced down at the babies. "These." Ethan felt something old and hot flare behind his ribs. Anger, yes, but more than that, recognition. He had seen men treated as inventory, watched the ledger books pretend otherwise. "You called it in," he said, not a question. "I did," Maddie replied. "Then my car died. Then my radio went." She gave a short, brittle laugh. "Funny how that works." Her hands tightened around the blanket, then loosened deliberately. "I ran. I ran until my lungs burned, and my legs stopped answering. I didn't know your cabin was here. I just followed the light." The kettle began to hiss. Ethan rose and poured water into a chipped mug, then another. He brought one to her and set it within reach. "Sip," he said. "Don't rush it." He took the other mug himself and drank, more for symmetry than thirst. Bear's ears lifted at a distant sound, wind through branches maybe, but his body stayed loose. Ethan trusted that more than silence. Maddie sipped. Color crept back into her fingers. "I'm from Missoula," she said after a moment, as if offering credentials to a jury she'd never asked for. "Been a cop 7 years. Before that, EMT. I don't quit on people." It wasn't a boast. It was a fact she carried like a scar. "I won't bring trouble to your door," she added quickly, "if I have to go back out." "You won't," Ethan said, and surprised himself with how certain it sounded. He set his mug down. "Not tonight." Her eyes searched his face, reading for conditions. "I don't even know your name," she said. "Ethan Cole." She nodded once. "Madison Hart." A pause. "Maddie." The fire popped, a sharp crack that made her flinch despite herself. Ethan noticed and filed it away with the rest. Trauma did not announce itself. It whispered. He moved to the window and eased a shutter open a finger's width, peering into the storm. The forest was a wall of motion and shadow. Tracks would vanish within minutes out there. That cut both ways. "There's an old line shack 2 miles south," he said, thinking aloud. "Collapsed roof, no heat. No one sane would choose it tonight." He closed the shutter. "Which means if someone's moving in this weather, it's because they think they have to." Maddie's mouth went thin. "They will," she said. "They don't like loose ends." She glanced at the door again, then at Bear. "He heard something. Earlier." "He hears everything," Ethan replied, "but he doesn't scare easy." The babies slept. One thumb found a mouth and stilled. Maddie watched them like a guard at a gate, the set of her shoulders easing just a fraction. "They don't have names," she said quietly. "Not yet. I found them wrapped in a delivery blanket behind a shuttered motel. 2 months old, maybe. I checked. No missing reports that match. That's not an accident." Ethan nodded. "We'll keep them warm," he said. "That's the first job." She exhaled, a long surrender she had postponed too long. "I can take first watch," she offered, reflex kicking in. "No," Ethan said gently. "You won't." He gestured to the chair near the fire. "You'll sit. You'll drink. You'll sleep when you can. Bear and I will listen." Bear thumped his tail once, agreement sealed. Hours passed in pieces. The storm leaned hard against the cabin, then eased, then returned with a different voice. Maddie's eyelids drooped despite her best efforts. She fought it, then laughed at herself, embarrassed. Ethan handed her a folded jacket, his thick and worn, and she draped it over the babies without protest. When her head finally tipped back against the cabinet, she slept in shallow intervals, waking to check the infants, then sleeping again. Ethan did not wake her. He sat at the table, cleaning a tool that did not need cleaning, watching the door and the dog and the fire in equal measure. Near dawn, Bear rose and went to the door, nose low. Ethan joined him, resting a hand on the dog's neck. Outside, the wind had shifted. Snow fell straighter now, heavier flakes that muffled the world. No footsteps, no engines. Nothing but the forest drawing a breath. Ethan allowed himself a thought he had not intended to have, that the light Maddie had followed might not have been his lantern at all. Might have been something else, something older and quieter, the kind that decided who arrived and when. He did not say it aloud. He simply returned to the fire and fed it, because some truths asked for care, not naming. When Maddie woke fully, the sky beyond the shutters had softened from black to iron gray. The baby slept on, safe for the moment. She met Ethan's eyes and held them. "I won't forget this," she said. "You don't have to," he replied. "Just rest." Outside, the storm loosened its grip, and with it came the certainty that the night had only opened the door. Whatever followed would not be carried by wind alone. My dear friend, Are you still walking with us through this story? Thank you for your patience, for staying, and for listening with your heart. Ethan had always believed that rules were not walls, but ropes, something you held to keep yourself from slipping into places you could not climb out of. And his most sacred rule had been simple: do not invite trouble across your threshold. The forest respected that rule. Storms came and went, animals passed, and the cabin remained a quiet agreement between a man and his solitude. He broke it anyway. The moment Bear's soft, pleading whine braided itself with the baby's wet cough, something inside Ethan loosened, and he felt the old hinge creak, the one that had closed after the war, after the funeral, after the day he learned that distance could be a kindness. He took one of the infants from Maddie with hands steadier than he felt, surprised by the weight, lighter than a sack of grain, heavier than a promise, and opened the door wider. In. Now, he had said, and when the door shut again, the rule lay behind it in the snow like a discarded glove. The cabin warmed differently after that, not just with heat, but with purpose, and Ethan noticed how his own breath found a slower rhythm, as if the house had taken responsibility for more than itself. He laid the baby down near the fire and adjusted the blanket, noting the fine down of hair at the crown, the faint crease between the brows that mirrored the twins even in sleep. Maddie watched with a mixture of relief and alarm, the kind that came from trusting someone with what you loved most while still counting exits, and Ethan respected that vigilance. He moved deliberately, narrating small actions aloud the way he had learned to do for skittish horses and frightened recruits. More wood, kettle closer, blanket folded twice. It kept panic from filling the quiet. Bear shifted positions to lie lengthwise between the door and the hearth, a dark, solid line of intent. 7 years old and broad through the chest, his muzzle silvering early, Bear carried scars like punctuation marks, a nicked ear from barbed wire, a pale seam along the flank from that ravine, and wore them without complaint. Maddie, finally upright enough to shed her boots, revealed feet swollen and red, socks stiff with cold. She grimaced and then smiled at herself, embarrassed by weakness she would not allow in daylight. Ethan fetched a basin and warm water, setting it down without comment. She thanked him anyway, voice low, and as she soaked her feet, she told him a little more, not names, not places, but the shape of the danger. The men she'd crossed were not loud criminals. They were accountants of cruelty, tidy and patient, the sort who made trouble look like coincidence. Ethan listened without interrupting, the way he had listened to artillery maps and radio static years ago, extracting pattern from noise. He thought of Sarah without meaning to. Sarah Miller. His wife before the war ended the way it did, tall and narrow-shouldered, hair the color of wheat in late summer, skin freckled from a life outdoors, a laugh that arrived half a second before the joke, as if she trusted joy to keep up. She had been the one to teach him that rules were useful until they became excuses, and the memory stung not because it hurt, but because it was true. Maddie finished with the basin and leaned back against the cabinet, exhaustion making her honest. "I won't ask you to fight my fight," she said, eyes on the babies. "I just need time, an hour, maybe 2. Ethan looked to the shuttered window, then to Bear, then back to her. "You'll have the morning," he said, "and then we'll decide." Dawn crept in, slow and colorless, a pewter light that flattened the forest into silhouettes. The storm had left behind a hush so complete it rang. Ethan stepped outside with Bear at heel, reading the ground the way he read faces. Snow scuffed here, a bent sapling there, nothing conclusive, everything suggestive. He circled wide, found no tracks that weren't already blurring into nothing, and returned to the porch with the sense of a held breath. Inside, Maddie slept at last, head tipped back, mouth parted, a crease between her brows that softened only when one of the twins sighed. Ethan sat at the table and wrote nothing in a ledger he kept for supplies, the pen moving because his hands needed a task. He listed facts instead of fears. 2 infants, approximate age, 1 injured officer, 1 dog, 1 cabin, weather clearing. When Maddie woke, she startled, hand searching for a weapon that was not there, then settled as the room reasserted itself. She apologized reflexively. Ethan waved it off. He fed the fire, poured coffee strong enough to argue with, and cut bread he had baked weeks earlier, stale but serviceable. They ate in companionable quiet, and Ethan noticed how Maddie's shoulders eased with each swallow, how competence returned like circulation to numb fingers. A knock did not come, but a sound did, engine noise, distant and brief, carried wrong by the cold. Bear lifted his head, ears forward, and Maddie froze. Ethan closed his eyes for a count of 3. "Road still buried," he said. "Could be nothing." "Could be looking," she replied. They shared a glance that acknowledged both possibilities. Ethan made the decision then, not as a hero, but as a man who understood thresholds. If the world insisted on crossing his, he would meet it standing. He gathered coats, checked the spare radio he kept for weather, dead, as expected, and moved the babies closer to the center of the room where heat pooled. "If they come," he said, choosing each word, "we don't open the door. We don't shout. We don't chase. We wait." Maddie nodded, the officer in her aligning with the survivor. "And if they try to burn us out?" she asked. Ethan met her gaze. "Then we break a different rule." The engine sound did not return, and the morning passed into a gray afternoon without incident. Maddie took one of the babies to her chest and hummed, a tune so soft it barely existed, and Ethan realized that the rule he had broken had not shattered his life, it had revealed it. When night fell again, the fire held steady, the babies slept, Bear kept watch, and the decision remained what it had been since the door closed. The cabin would not give back what it had taken in. Whatever came next would come to them. My dear friend, are you still walking with us through this story? Thank you for your patience, for staying, and for listening with your heart. Firelight changes the truth. Ethan had learned that overseas, when debriefings happened under bare bulbs, and the truth bent itself around whatever would keep men standing. Here, the truth came softer, carried by the hush between crackling logs and the tiny rhythmic breaths of sleeping children. He fed the stove until the iron sighed, then stepped back, letting the heat spread. Maddie sat cross-legged on the floor, jacket off now, sleeves rolled to reveal forearms mapped with small scars, and a faint tremor she kept tamped down with discipline. The babies lay between them, swaddled and still, their chests rising and falling like the smallest tide. Bear held his post near the door, a dark sentinel whose ears pivoted at each pop of sap. Outside, the forest listened. "I'll tell you everything I can," Maddie said at last, voice low so it wouldn't startle the infants. Not names, not yet, but the shape of it. She took a breath and steadied herself the way Ethan had seen soldiers do before stepping onto ice. "I was working a transfer corridor, border adjacent, papered clean. Trucks that never show up on logs, motels that change owners every season. I found the motel because a clerk called in a welfare check and then recanted. That's usually when the lie shows." Ethan nodded, his attention unwavering. He had shifted a chair closer, not looming, but present. He noticed how Maddie's eyes never left the babies for long, how each sentence curved back to them like gravity. "They were in a service hallway," she continued, wrapped in a courier blanket. No diaper bag, no formula. Whoever left them wanted distance. Distance erases fingerprints. Her mouth tightened. "I didn't wait for backup. I should have. but they were cold. The confession cost her something. Ethan saw it in the way she flexed her hands, grounding herself against the floorboards. He thought of Sarah again. Sarah with her long, patient neck and the way she used to fold laundry, as if each shirt deserved a future. Sarah had believed that waiting was sometimes just another way of leaving. Ethan had disagreed then. He did not now. "They sabotaged my cruiser," Maddie said. "Fuel line nicked clean. Radio went quiet in the trees like it had never learned to speak. I took the babies and ran because the hallway had eyes." She huffed a short laugh. "I didn't plan to outrun winter. I planned to outlast it." Ethan leaned back, absorbing. "And the men," he said. "How many?" "Enough," she replied. "And patient. They don't kick doors. They let weather and hunger do it for them." She glanced at Bear. "Unless something unexpected refuses." Bear's tail thumped once, slow and deliberate, as if he'd been addressed directly. Ethan rose and poured water into the kettle again. A ritual, that. Kept his hands honest. "There's a ranger station east," he said. "Seasonal. Closed in winter. Antenna still up." He didn't say more, but the possibility hovered. Maddie's gaze followed his thought, and then fell away. "If I move," she said, "they'll see. They want me to move." The babies stirred, one making a soft, questioning sound. Maddie leaned forward and adjusted the blanket, whispering reassurance with a voice that could have calmed a roomful of strangers. Ethan felt the weight of that voice, the way it had learned to steady others while neglecting itself, and recognized the cost. He crouched and slid a small tin across the floor. "Honey," he said, "a drop on the gums if they fuss." He paused. "If you want." She nodded, gratitude brief but real. "Thank you." The fire settled. In the quiet, a memory crept in that Ethan hadn't invited. He saw himself younger, hands shaking as he cleaned a rifle under a tent light. Sarah sitting across from him, hair braided over one shoulder, skin pale from winter, eyes bright with a trust he hadn't earned yet. She had been tall, almost willowy, her strength hidden in the way she held her ground without raising her voice. When the news came, the roadside accident, the slick curve, the truck that never braked, Ethan's rules had calcified. Distance had become doctrine. Tonight, that doctrine softened under the weight of 2 sleeping children and a woman who had run through snow because staying still would have been worse. A new sound intruded, a faint, stuttering chirp from the corner shelf. Maddie startled. Ethan crossed the room and lifted an old handheld radio, its casing scratched and dulled, the antenna bent like a question mark. He twisted the dial, coaxing static into coherence. A voice surfaced and sank again. He caught a name once, distorted. "Cal," then nothing. Ethan set the radio down. "It's not for talking," he said, "just for listening." Maddie exhaled. "That's enough," she said. Night deepened. Snow tapped the shutters like fingers counting time. Maddie finished her account, the edges filled in with restraint. How she doubled back once to throw tracks, how she crossed a frozen creek because water tells lies to men who can't read it, how she followed a lantern glow she thought was hallucination until it wasn't. Ethan listened without interrupting, the way one listens to a map being drawn in charcoal, fragile, precise, easily smudged by fear. When she fell silent, Ethan spoke, choosing the truth he could offer without pretending to be more than he was. "I won't turn you out," he said. "Not tonight, not while they're sleeping." He gestured to the infants. "In the morning, we plan. We don't rush. We don't disappear. We make it cost them time." Maddie studied him then, really studied him. The angular planes of his face, the short beard flecked with gray, the calm that did not ask for permission. "You've done this before," she said. He met her gaze. "Different uniforms," he replied. "Same weather." Bear rose and paced 1 ounce, then settled again, satisfied. The babies breathed. The fire burned steady. In that small triangle of warmth, Maddie felt something she hadn't allowed herself since the hallway, the right to stop running for a breath. "If this goes wrong," she said quietly, "I don't want you blamed." Ethan shook his head. "Blame is cheap," he said. "Doing right isn't." They kept watch together until the hour thinned and the forest grew honest again. When Maddie finally slept, chin tipped toward her chest, Ethan moved a blanket over her shoulders without waking her. He sat back at the table and wrote in his ledger again, this time naming the thing he had refused to name earlier. "We will stand." He did not know how long that standing would last. He knew only that the choice had been made when the door closed and did not require repeating. Outside, winter exhaled. Inside, 2 infants slept, a dog listened, and a veteran accepted that some rules are meant to be broken once, cleanly, so better ones can take their place. My dear friend, are you still walking with us through this story? Thank you for your patience, for staying, and for listening with your heart. Morning arrived without ceremony, a pale, reluctant light pressing against the windows as if unsure it was welcome. The storm had moved on, but winter remained, settled deep and heavy over the forest. Snow lay thick and unbroken beyond the porch, smoothing the world into a dangerous calm. Ethan woke before the fire softened, before Maddie stirred, before the babies shifted in their sleep. He sat at the edge of the table with his boots already on, listening, not for sound, but for the absence of it. Silence, after a storm, could be honest. Or it could be a lie waiting to be stepped on. Bear broke that silence first. The German shepherd rose from his place by the door with a sharpness that snapped Ethan fully awake. Bear's ears went rigid, his body angling toward the porch as if drawn by a thread only he could see. He did not bark, not yet. He moved forward, nails whispering against the floorboards, then let out a single low huff that carried more meaning than noise. Ethan followed without speaking. Years ago, a blast overseas had taught him the cost of ignoring small warnings. Since then, he trusted the quiet signals more than alarms. He opened the door just enough to let cold spill in. Bear surged past him, boots crunching after as Ethan stepped onto the porch. The forest stood frozen and indifferent, trees bowed under the weight of snow, branches stitched together by white. Bear trotted to the left, stopped, then sat abruptly, eyes fixed on the ground near a fallen spruce that had cracked in the storm. Ethan knelt, brushing snow aside with the edge of his glove. Footprints. They were new, sharp at the edges, not yet softened by drift or wind. Adult boots, heavy tread, not hiking soles. The spacing told him the man had not been running, not yet. Someone confident enough to move slow, patient enough to let winter do the work. Ethan followed the line with his eyes until it disappeared among the trees, then checked the perimeter. There were more. Not many. Enough. Behind him, Maddie stood in the doorway, jacket pulled tight, one baby strapped to her chest and the other cradled in her arms. Her face had gone still, the way it did when instinct overtook fatigue. "They found us," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Ethan straightened and closed the door against the cold. "They found tracks," he replied. "Not us. Yet." He took in her stance, the way she'd shifted her weight to protect the infants, the way her eyes scanned lines of approach. She was injured, exhausted, and still thinking 3 steps ahead. He respected that. He also knew when it wasn't enough. "I can move," Maddie said. "I'll circle wide, pull them off you." It was the voice of a woman who had spent her life stepping between danger and others. Ethan shook his head once. "You carry 2 babies through. This snow, you don't pull anything except fate," he said. The words were blunt, but his tone was not unkind. "You'd be offering yourself to the cold." Bear returned to his side, pressing his shoulder briefly into Ethan's knee, a grounding touch. The dog's coat was dusted white now, his breath steady, eyes alert but calm. 7 years old, trained by necessity rather than command, Bear had learned that stillness could be louder than aggression. He looked back toward the trees once more, then away, as if marking the danger and setting it aside until called. Ethan made the decision the way he made most, without ceremony, without debate. "We go east," he said. "Old ranger station. 3 miles if we cut the ridge. Antenna might still catch something." Maddie frowned. "If they're tracking, they expect us to run," Ethan cut in. "We won't. We'll move like we belong here." He crossed the room and pulled a canvas pack from beneath the bench, laying out supplies with quick precision. Extra wool, jerky, a thermos, a flare gun, old but serviceable. He handed Maddie a heavier coat, lined and worn soft with age. "Put this on," he said. "It's not pretty, it's warm." She hesitated, pride flaring, then nodded and slipped it on. It swallowed her frame, but steadied her posture. They left no unnecessary signs behind. Ethan brushed the floor near the door, wiped the latch, fed the fire down to embers that would not smoke. Outside, he took a long branch and dragged it across their own tracks, then led them along a route that hugged stone and shadow, places where snow held less memory. Bear ranged ahead and back, silent, his body a question mark in motion. Maddie followed carefully, breath measured, murmuring to the infants when the wind rose. The babies slept, unaware of the map being drawn around them. The forest thickened as they climbed. Ethan kept them off the obvious path, choosing routes that bent rather than broke. Animal trails, windswept ridges where footprints lost their edges. He moved like a man who had learned that survival was not speed but selection. Maddie watched him work with a mix of gratitude and unease. "You've done this," she said quietly when the slope eased. Ethan didn't look back. "Different reasons," he replied. "Same weather." They reached the ranger station by late morning, a squat structure half buried by snow, its roof sagging but intact. The door hung crooked on its hinges, paint peeled to the wood beneath. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old oil. Ethan swept the room quickly, checking corners, windows, the back exit that led to a frozen clearing. Satisfied, he set Maddie down near a bench and moved to the radio tower outside, Bear flanking him. The antenna stood like a bent finger, pointing nowhere. Ethan climbed with careful economy, the metal cold through his gloves. He adjusted the angle, tightened a bolt, then descended and tuned the receiver inside. Static. Then a voice, thin, broken, but real. Maddie's head snapped up. Ethan leaned close, coaxing signal from noise. A dispatcher, miles away, not expecting miracles. Ethan pressed the transmit. "Emergency," he said, keeping his voice level. "Injured officer. 2 infants. Coordinates to follow." He rattled them off from memory, precise as prayer. The voice acknowledged, asked him to repeat. He did. Relief came like a wave that didn't quite break. Maddie closed her eyes for a second, then opened them, sharper than before. "They'll triangulate," she said. "If they're listening." Ethan nodded. "That's why we won't stay." He packed quickly, leaving the station as they found it, a rumor of presence rather than proof. On the way back, Bear stopped suddenly, nose to the wind. Ethan crouched. More tracks, fresher now, intersecting where they had not been minutes before. The men were closer, adjusting. One of them stepped into view between trees, a tall figure bundled in dark gear, face obscured, posture relaxed in a way that betrayed experience. He paused, scanned, then lifted a hand, signaling to someone unseen. Maddie felt the moment tighten like a wire. She shifted the babies higher, ready to run if told. Ethan didn't tell her. He rose slowly, placing himself between her and the trees, his presence deliberate. Bear moved to his side, teeth unseen, silence absolute. The man watched them for a long heartbeat, calculating. Then he turned away, melting back into the forest. They did not chase, they did not flee. They walked, steady and unhurried, until the trees swallowed the space where the man had stood. Ethan's pulse slowed only after a mile had passed without pursuit. "He wanted us to bolt," Maddie said. Ethan nodded. Patience cuts both ways. By the time the cabin came back into view, smoke rising thin and honest from the chimney, the day had tilted toward afternoon. Ethan ushered them inside, barred the door, and fed the fire. Maddie sank onto the bench, breath finally breaking. "You didn't run," she said, half wonder, half accusation. Ethan set the pack down. "Running gives them answers," he replied. "Standing asks questions." Outside, the forest held its tongue. Inside, the baby slept on. Bear resumed his watch, and Ethan accepted the truth that had been forming since dawn. Whoever followed them would return. And when they did, the rules would not save them. Only choices would. My dear friend, are you still walking with us through this story? Thank you for your patience, for staying, and for listening with your heart. They reached the edge of town just before noon, the forest loosening its grip as the trees thinned and the road widened into packed snow scored by wagon ruts and tire tracks. The place was small enough to miss if you blinked. One main street, a feed store with a sagging awning, a diner whose windows glowed like held breath, and a sheriff's office that leaned slightly left as if tired of standing straight. Ethan slowed his pace without thinking. Towns did that to him. They demanded names, explanations, and the kind of eye contact that came with history. Bear felt it too, his gait shortening, shoulders rolling with alert patience. Maddie adjusted the babies higher against her chest and squared herself, the way she had learned to do before stepping into rooms where stories were already forming. The first looks came quickly. A man in a wool cap paused mid-step, eyes flicking from Maddie's bruised face to the infants bundled against her, then to Ethan's weathered coat and Bear's imposing frame. He said nothing, but his silence traveled. By the time they reached the diner, whispers had learned to walk. Maddie caught fragments. No car, babies, that dog, who's he? And felt the old burn of being judged without a report filed. She kept moving. The door chimed, and warmth rolled out to meet them, carrying the smell of coffee and grease and something sweet. Inside, the diner was narrow and crowded with the usual noon regulars. Men with hands like split wood, women with eyes sharp from keeping accounts. Conversation dipped and rose again, changed but not stopped. Maddie felt it land on her shoulders like a wet coat. Ethan chose a booth near the wall, his back to it, sightlines clean. Bear lay at his feet, calm and massive, a presence that discouraged curiosity without threatening it. Maddie slid in opposite, careful not to jostle the babies. A waitress approached, young, freckles, hair pinned tight, and hesitated. "Coffee?" she asked, voice polite but cautious. Ethan nodded. "Please." Maddie managed a smile. "And hot water," she added softly, "if that's okay." The waitress nodded again and fled toward the counter, already carrying a story she would not tell outright. The coffee arrived strong and mercifully not burnt. Ethan took a sip and allowed himself a quiet approval. Maddie wrapped her hands around the mug for warmth more than taste. That was when Mrs. Eleanor Briggs appeared, as if summoned by necessity rather than noise. Eleanor was in her late 60s, tall for her age, posture straight despite a limp earned years earlier when ice and pride had conspired against her. Her hair was iron gray, swept into a bun that never loosened, her face lined in a way that suggested laughter had once been frequent and chosen. She wore a heavy coat the color of oatmeal and gloves mended more times than replaced. Eleanor had taught school, run church kitchens, and buried a husband with the same steady dignity she brought to everything else. She set a small crate on the table without asking, milk bottles, wrapped bread, a jar of honey, and looked at Mattie over her glasses with eyes that saw without measuring. "Children don't need explanations," Eleanor said, her voice firm and kind. "They need warmth." Mattie swallowed hard, the words landing somewhere behind her ribs. "Thank you," she managed. Eleanor waved it off, already reaching to adjust a blanket corner with a grandmother's authority. She glanced at Ethan, took in his posture, his quiet. "You look like you know how to keep your mouth shut," she said. "That's a virtue around here." Ethan inclined his head. "So I've heard." Eleanor smiled once, sharp and approving, then turned to Bear. "And you," she said, as if addressing an old colleague, "you keep them honest." Bear's tail thumped the floor once. Ethan leaned down and murmured, "She's the kind the world needs more than guns." Eleanor's mouth twitched. "Careful," she said, "I can still hear." Across the room, the sheriff watched. Tom Keller was a thick-necked man with a jaw like a shelf and a mustache he'd grown because no one had told him not to. He'd been sheriff for 12 years, long enough to learn when to ask questions and when to let time do the work. He rose slowly and approached their booth, hands visible, posture neutral. "Officer Hart," he said, voice even. Mattie met his gaze. "Sheriff Keller." He glanced at the babies, then at Ethan. "You're a ways from your cruiser." Mattie didn't flinch. "It broke." Keller nodded, as if that settled it for now. "We can talk later," he said, "when you're ready." He looked at Ethan. "You from around here?" Ethan met his eyes. "Close enough." Keller studied him a moment longer, then nodded once. "Coffee's on the house," he said to the waitress as he passed. It wasn't an endorsement. It was a pause. Rumors did what rumors do. By the time Mattie finished half her mug, she could feel the story changing shape. Less accusation, more curiosity, edged with caution. A woman at the counter slid over a knitted cap, pretending it had fallen. A man by the window stood and left without paying, embarrassed by his own staring. Eleanor lingered just long enough to ensure the milk was cold and the bread still warm, then patted Mattie's arm. "You eat," she said. "Then you rest." Mattie nodded, eyes bright. "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor corrected her gently. "Eleanor." They left the diner with supplies and fewer eyes on their backs. Outside, the cold bit cleanly, honest. Ethan steered them toward the general store, where a bell rang and a clerk with ink-stained fingers pretended not to notice anything unusual. Ethan purchased diapers, formula, a map. Mattie noticed how he paid. In cash, counted twice, took a receipt anyway. He was careful in the way men become careful when they've paid dearly for mistakes. At the edge of town, Mattie stopped. "They'll talk," she said. "They always do." Ethan adjusted the pack on his shoulder. "Let them," he replied. "Talking keeps hands busy." Bear glanced back once, then forward, ready. They returned to the cabin by a longer route, the forest welcoming them back with its familiar indifference. Inside, the fire took again, obedient. Mattie fed the babies and watched them sleep, the diner's warmth still clinging to her like borrowed courage. "I don't like being seen," she said quietly. Ethan sat across from her, coffee steaming. "Neither do I," he said, "but sometimes being seen buys you time." As night fell, the town receded into memory and rumor, its judgment softened by bread and milk and a woman who knew what mattered. Ethan checked the perimeter once more, then settled by the fire. Mattie watched the flames and felt, for the first time since the hallway, that the world might hold long enough for help to arrive. "My dear friend, are you still walking with us through this story? Thank you for your patience, for staying, and for listening with your heart." Night settled over the cabin with a patience that felt intentional. Snow drifted softly against the windows, tapping like fingertips testing glass, while the forest held its breath. Inside, the fire burned low and steady. Maddie sat on the floor with her back against the couch, one infant asleep against her shoulder, the other resting in the crook of her arm. Her uniform was folded nearby, stained and torn, but her posture still carried the muscle memory of duty. She had not slept, not really, since the town. Every sound was catalogued, every shadow weighed. Bear lay between her and the door, broad chest rising and falling, eyes half-lidded, but awake in the way that mattered. Ethan was at the table, sharpening a knife he hoped not to use. The sound was slow, deliberate. He had lived long enough to know that calm could be a weapon too. The cabin felt smaller at night, the walls closer, the windows like watchful eyes. He checked his watch and then the perimeter again, moving with the quiet efficiency that came from years of learning what not to disturb. When he returned inside, Bear's head lifted an inch. Ethan followed the dog's gaze to the door. The knock came without drama, 3 firm raps, evenly spaced. Not the frantic pounding of someone lost, not the hesitant tap of a neighbor. It was the knock of a man who expected an answer. Maddie's breath caught. She didn't move, but her grip tightened around the baby's blanket. Ethan raised a hand, palm down, a silent instruction. He moved to the door and spoke without opening it. "It's late," he said. "Road's rough." A voice answered, smooth and unhurried. "I won't take long." The man introduced himself as Daniel Ross, his tone friendly, practiced. He said he was looking for relatives, said there were rumors of a woman passing through with infants, said family worried. Ethan pictured him without seeing him, mid-30s, clean enough to inspire trust, boots chosen for distance rather than work. Men like that had come before, wearing concern like a jacket. Bear stood, placing his body squarely between Maddie and the door. His hackles rose, not a growl yet, just a warning stitched into fur. Maddie whispered, barely sound. "They're here." Ethan nodded once. He slid the bolt just enough to open the door a crack, keeping the chain latched. Cold air rushed in, carrying the faint scent of oil and something sharper beneath it. The man outside leaned slightly, peering into the gap. He had a narrow face, clean-shaven, eyes too alert for the hour. His coat was expensive, but scuffed to look traveled. "Just need a word," he said, smiling with his mouth, not his eyes. Ethan met that smile with stillness. "About?" he asked. The man's gaze flicked past Ethan, toward the shadows behind him. "2 babies," he said lightly. "Family's worried." Maddie felt heat rise behind her eyes, not fear alone, but anger, bright and ferocious. She shifted, and Bear shifted with her, a living wall. The man noticed. His smile thinned. "They need paperwork," he added. "Protection." Ethan's voice stayed level. "They're asleep." He let the word hang there, heavy as a verdict. The man exhaled, recalibrated. "I can come back in the morning," he offered. Ethan shook his head. "No." Silence stretched. Snow whispered. Somewhere far off, a branch cracked. The man's eyes hardened for a fraction of a second, enough to confirm what Ethan already knew. "You don't want trouble," the man said quietly. Ethan leaned closer to the crack in the door. "Then you should leave." Bear growled then, low and unmistakable, the sound of a boundary drawn. The man stepped back, palms up, performance intact. "All right," he said. "No harm meant." He turned and walked into the dark, boots crunching with deliberate confidence. Ethan waited until the sound faded before closing the door and setting the bolt fully. Maddie let out a breath she didn't remember holding. "They'll be back," she said. Ethan nodded. "Or someone else will." They didn't waste the night. Ethan moved with purpose, setting up lights outside, small, angled, meant to silhouette rather than illuminate. He adjusted a camera near the tree line, one he'd salvaged years ago and never expected to use. Maddie documented everything, her phone recording timestamps, descriptions, her voice steady even as her hands trembled. "Evidence," she murmured, more to herself than him. Ethan called the sheriff, his words precise, unemotional. "Visitor," he said, "asking about infants. False pretense." There was a pause on the line, then a promise to send a patrol at first light. When the work was done, they sat together by the fire. Maddie stared at the flames, jaw tight. "They talk about family," she said, "as if that excuses it." Ethan watched the embers shift. "Predators borrow good words," he replied. "It helps them sleep." Maddie looked down at the babies, pink-cheeked, breathing easy. The anger returned, sharper now. "They see objects," she said, "not lives." Ethan met her gaze. "Not here," he said, "not tonight." Outside, the forest listened. Inside, the cabin held. Bear resumed his watch, a sentinel carved from muscle and loyalty. Maddie finally closed her eyes, not sleeping, but resting against the certainty that they had stopped running. The knock had come. It had been answered. And this time the door had not opened wide enough to let the dark in. "My dear friend, are you still walking with us through this story? Thank you for your patience, for staying, and for listening with your heart." Dawn arrived thin and pale, the kind that looks borrowed from another day. Snow drifted like breath across the clearing, and the forest stood quiet, not in surrender, but in watchful respect. Ethan woke before the light settled, the way he always did when a reckoning was near. He stepped outside with Bear at his heel, boots crunching softly, eyes reading the world for what it would not say out loud. The cabin exhaled smoke behind him, a small, stubborn signal that warmth still mattered. Inside, Maddie held the babies close, rocking them with the patient rhythm she had learned on long nights when duty didn't clock out and fear tried to write its own orders. The sound came first, engines distant and deliberate, then voices carried by cold. Sheriff Tom Keller arrived with 2 cruisers and a truck from the county line, tires biting snow, doors opening in a choreography practiced by men who preferred daylight to surprises. Keller's face was set, mustache rimmed with frost, eyes steady. He was not alone. From the edge of the trees emerged a handful of townspeople who had answered a call that did not require names. A mechanic with shoulders like anvils, a librarian with iron resolve behind wire-rimmed glasses, and Mrs. Eleanor Briggs, coat buttoned high, scarf tucked with purpose. Eleanor's limp slowed her, but did not stop her. She carried herself like someone who had decided, years ago, that fear was a poor excuse for silence. The confrontation did not announce itself with gunfire. It unfolded the way truth sometimes does, incremental, exposed by patience. The man who had knocked the night before returned with company, believing leverage grew in daylight. He brought 2 others, both lean, both dressed for movement rather than warmth, faces trained into neutrality. They stopped at the tree line when they saw the cruisers, the cameras Ethan had angled just right, the quiet line of people who had chosen to stand where rumors had tried to sit. The lead man's confidence thinned. He adjusted his coat, tried on a smile that did not fit. "We're here to clear a misunderstanding," he said, voice carrying just enough to be heard. Maddie stepped forward then, shoulders squared, baby secured against her chest. Her face bore the map of exhaustion and resolve, a bruise fading into yellow at her cheekbone, eyes sharp with clarity. "There is no misunderstanding," she said. There is a crime. Keller did not rush it. He asked for names, papers, reasons. He listened. He watched hands. He let the men talk themselves into corners they had rehearsed poorly. Ethan stayed slightly back, Bear seated at his side, the dog's amber eyes never leaving the men's boots. When one of them shifted his weight, Bear's ears lifted, a subtle correction. The mechanic filmed on his phone, steady as a tripod. The librarian took notes. Eleanor crossed her arms and said nothing, which was somehow louder than the rest. Evidence accumulated like snowfall, quiet, undeniable. Ethan's footage caught the knock, the questions, the moment a lie recognized itself. Maddie's report was clear, chronological, unadorned. Keller's deputies uncovered a vehicle parked beyond the ridge, plates masked, the interior arranged for transport rather than travel. The men's story collapsed under the weight of specifics. When Keller finally said the words, "Detained for questioning," Winter seemed to pause, as if listening to see whether courage would hold. It did. The men were escorted away, their boots leaving tracks that would not last the hour. The townspeople lingered, then dispersed, work calling them back with a gentler insistence than fear had brought them. Eleanor stayed long enough to tuck a blanket corner around the babies and press a hand to Maddie's arm. "You did right," she said. Maddie's mouth trembled. "I just did my job." Eleanor smiled, knowing better. "Sometimes," she said, "those are different things." The machinery of protection moved next, efficient and unromantic. A caseworker arrived by afternoon, Sarah Collins, mid-40s, tall and spare, auburn hair pulled into a low knot that meant business, skin pale from winters spent indoors with files rather than fields. Her eyes were kind, but trained to measure risk. She spoke softly to Maddie, asked permission before touching anything, listened more than she talked. The babies, now documented as wards pending placement, were examined with gentle thoroughness. Sarah explained the program in plain language, never once using the word temporary without adding safe. Maddie nodded, absorbing each detail, anger and relief sharing the same narrow space inside her chest. When it was done, when signatures were signed and assurances made, the cabin grew quiet again. The sheriff left last, tipping his hat to Ethan. "You did us a favor," he said. Ethan shook his head. "Just kept a fire going." Keller paused, then nodded, understanding something he would not say. Bear accepted a pat like a benediction. Dusk came early. The forest softened, snow taking on the blue of evening. Maddie stood on the porch with the babies, wrapped in borrowed warmth, tears slipping free without permission. "I thought I was just doing my duty," she said, voice breaking on the word thought. "Turns out I was looking for home." Ethan leaned against the doorframe, hands in his pockets, discomfort disguised as humor. "Home," he said, "at minimum needs fire, blankets, and a dog who insists on interrupting serious conversations." Bear wagged, unapologetic, as if to say that civility was overrated and presence was not. Later, when the stars appeared one by one like quiet witnesses, Ethan stood alone at the edge of the clearing. The white forest looked like a blank page, unforgiving and full of promise. He thought of rules he had broken and those he had kept, of a life pared down to essentials. Behind him, Maddie laughed softly as she settled the babies, a sound that felt earned. Winter had not ended. It had stepped back, just enough to let courage write a line the cold could not erase. In the end, no thunder split the sky, no angel appeared in blinding light. The miracle came the way it so often does in real life, quietly. It came as a door opened instead of stayed shut, as a fire kept burning through the night, as a woman choosing to protect life even when she herself was breaking, as a man who thought he had chosen solitude only to discover God had chosen him for mercy. Scripture tells us that God does not always speak through storms or earthquakes, but through a still, gentle whisper. Perhaps that whisper is what moved a veteran to stand his ground. Perhaps it is what placed a loyal dog at the right door at the right moment. Perhaps it is what carried two fragile lives safely through the cold. And perhaps, if you are listening now, that same gentle hand has guided you here for a reason. In our daily lives, we may never face a blizzard or a knock from danger, but we all face moments where we must choose to turn away or to open the door, to protect only ourselves or to stand for what is right. To believe the world is only cruel, or to believe that love, when chosen, is still stronger. If this story touched your heart, consider sharing it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Your voice matters more than you know. And if you believe in second chances, quiet courage, and the unseen miracles that still walk among us, please subscribe to the channel so more stories like this can reach the souls who need them. May God bless you and keep you. May His light warm you in your coldest seasons. And may you never underestimate the power of kindness, because through it, miracles are still being written.